It begins with silence, a hush that falls across the reed fields at dusk. The sun is a tired disk of amber, sagging behind distant dunes. And somewhere, beyond the river's bend, a warlord stirs in his tent, listening to the wind, as if it carries secrets too ancient to be written down. This is not the thunderous invasion of bronze-slick armies, nor the roaring storm of war drums and clashing spears. No, this is a quieter conquest, older, colder, the kind that creeps on sandal soles, through whispering grass. The warlord, nameless to us, but feared by many, rises from a bed of woven palm and lion skins. He has teeth like date stones, and eyes like carved obsidian. His arms are wrapped in linen strips, inked with symbols only the moon understands. By the light of a fireless lantern, he traces a map sketched in ash and oil, not a map of borders or kings, but of vulnerabilities, cattle paths, water sources, goat tracks between huts. For the mudbrick villages are not fortresses. They are soft, sun-dried dwellings baked by 1,000 seasons. Walls that crumble with time and envy, roofs that sag when the rains remember them. And still, within their fragile limits, families dream, granaries sleep, and pottery sings in the wind. The warlord knows them well. He has watched from ridges, counted fire pits by night, measured the turning of oxen carts by day. He is not cruel but calculated. For in 2000 BCE, to survive is to conquer, to eat is to own, to endure is to remove those who would otherwise thrive. He gathers his men, not many, but enough. Broad-shouldered shadows with flint eyes, and silent steps. Each one carries a curved blade, a sling, a club, nothing gleaming, nothing loud. Only the dull honesty of bone, stone, and rage. They paint their faces with river clay. They whisper prayers to nameless gods. And as the stars gather like ancient witnesses overhead, they move, not with urgency, but with purpose. There is no trumpet, only a heron's startled cry as they cross the water. The reeds part and close behind them, like a secret being kept. When they reach the edge of the village, they wait for the right breath, the right drift of cloud, the moment when the wind changes, and the dogs stop barking. And then, but that will come soon enough. For now, rest your eyes, let the fires dim, and know that in the lands where history whispers, even a warlord moves like a ghost, through the scent of mud and grain. By the time the crescent moon hung low over the floodplain, the warband had already crossed the last shallow stream. Their sandals left almost no imprint in the damp earth. Dust and river silt clung to their cloaks, masking the scent of men. They moved in a single file, each one knowing his place without a word spoken. At their head was the warlord. He wasn't a king, not by the reckoning of scribes, but in this stretch of river valley, far from the stone temples and rule-bound cities, he was something more useful. A man who could take what he needed and hold what he took. That was the real power of the age. Not divine right, but practical control. Especially when food stores were low and the wet season had failed the barley fields. The target was small, a cluster of mudbrick homes arranged in a half-circle near a dry riverbed. Maybe 30 people lived there, maybe more during planting season. Most would be asleep now. Children curled beside ovens, elders wrapped in reed mats, granaries sealed with plaster and prayer. There would be guards, but only a few, the kind of men who carried sticks more than blades. Protectors in name, not in readiness. In truth, this wasn't a battle, not in the heroic sense. No bronze armor, no chariots, just calculated intrusion, the way it was done before kingdoms wrote rules about honor. The warlord had been doing this for years. In lean seasons, when his own stores ran thin, he moved. He didn't raid at random. He chose targets based on careful watching. Who had surplus, who had new pottery, who had goats too fat for hard times. The moonlight made it easy to spot the village from the ridge. Fires were already low. 1 or 2 flickers inside homes, maybe someone tending a baby or heating stones to sleep beside. A dog barked in the distance, but it wasn't an alarm, just a half-hearted greeting to the wind. The warlord waited. This part always mattered. You didn't just walk in. You studied the rhythm of the place, when people changed watch, when the goats stirred, when the silence deepened. When the time came, he raised his hand. His men fanned out. No war cries, just the rustle of reeds and the soft click of bone-handled knives being drawn from loops of cloth. At the edge of the village, one man slipped past a collapsed section of the low wall. Another scaled a storehouse with the help of an overgrown vine. They moved like they'd done it before because they had. Villages like this were everywhere in 2000 BCE. Some near rivers, others near oases. Independent but similar. You could predict them. You could exploit them. The goal wasn't slaughter. That kind of noise brought retaliation. No, this was about grain, goats, tools, maybe a few laborers if they didn't scream too much. In this world, conquest wasn't about flags or temples. It was about the movement of resources. One village's wealth was another's salvation. Inside the largest hut, a clay jar tipped over. Someone whispered. A figure stirred near the doorway, startled. A young woman, maybe, just as a shadow passed behind her. She didn't have time to scream. A hand covered her mouth. She struggled, then froze. They wouldn't harm her. Not if things went according to plan. By the time the rooster crowed, the work would be done. The goats would be gone. The stores lighter. Maybe a small fire would be set at the edge of the field. Not to destroy, just to send a message. A soft one. The warlord stepped through the threshold of a hut and glanced around. Clay figurines. A spindle. Baskets sealed with date leaves. It was a good haul. Not great, but good. Enough to buy his people another 2 weeks of stability. This was how war was waged in the shadows of empire. Not with ceremony, but with strategy. Not for glory, but for survival. By the time the last torch was extinguished, the village was different. Not destroyed, no, that was rarely the way, but altered, shifted slightly off its center. A few doors ajar where they hadn't been. Some footprints where none should be. A jar missing from a dark corner. A tether loosened from a post. The warlord moved among the homes as though walking through reeds. He stepped lightly, noting things most wouldn't. The shape of the roof lines, the way the fences leaned. You learned to read these signs if you led men on these kinds of nights. A wall half repaired meant a family was busy, maybe too busy to guard the storeroom properly. A narrow, unused path behind the granary often meant a second entrance. Children's toys beside a hut could mark which families had less to give, less worth taking. He wasn't without a code. Brutality was wasteful. Taking too much was just an invitation for pursuit or revenge. He took what was needed and moved on, like wind hollowing out a dune. You don't burn a village unless you need to, and tonight there was no need. Near the center of the village stood the tall storehouse. Its door had been barred with reeds and packed clay, but one of his men had already breached it from the side. A low opening hidden behind a water jar. Inside, baskets of barley sat in orderly rows, sealed with waxy plugs of fig sap and straw. It was well kept, and even in the dark, the smell of grain, earthy and clean, rose to greet him like a welcome. Take only from the middle, he told his second. Leave the top baskets untouched. If the villagers found their topmost stores undisturbed, they might assume a rodent or a family mistake. Maybe time lost track of account. Panic wouldn't set in right away. It was a trick he had used before. Small disappearances gave more time to vanish. He looked out past the storehouse to where the goats were already being led into the night. Just 5, all healthy. They wouldn't be missed until morning. Maybe not even then if the villagers believed they had wandered off to graze too early. A dog barked once, then twice. Too close. The warlord's head turned sharply. That was the risk of every raid. Not violence, but noise. A shout, a scream, a dog's alarm. It could bring spears and questions. He moved quickly toward the sound and found the source. One of the boys, no more than 10, barefoot, standing beside a half-eaten melon and staring into the dark. He hadn't seen the men. Not yet. He was just listening, confused. The warlord raised a hand. One of his men started forward, a club in hand. No, the warlord said. His voice was quiet but firm. He approached the child himself and knelt. In another life, the boy might have been his own. The same black hair, same dirt-smeared cheek. He took the melon gently and handed it back to the boy. Then he turned him by the shoulders and nudged him toward the house. The boy walked. Not a word said. It was a small risk, but mercy too had its place in the old rules. When he returned to the edge of the village, his men were nearly ready. The last bundles of grain were being packed, the ropes secured. The goats led quietly along the dry path to the east. The sky was beginning to shift. Not sunrise yet, but the promise of it. A faint graying at the edge of the stars. Birds rustled from a cluster of fig trees nearby. Soon the village would wake. He gave the signal and they vanished. Not like ghosts, but like men who knew how to come and go in the cracks of history. By mid-morning, the village would feel it. A weight missing, but not immediately visible. It would take time to notice. That was the point. A trail of goat prints led eastward, but only faint ones. A cracked pot sat outside a door that hadn't been cracked the night before. Some children might whisper about dreams they didn't remember. The warlord walked in the rear of the column, his eyes scanning the path behind them. He had done what needed doing. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for food. For the steady beat of survival that had kept him alive long enough to become a man feared in the night. He did not smile. He did not speak. He just kept walking. Dawn rolled slowly across the plain, unbothered by what had passed in the dark. It touched the tops of acacia trees first, then slid down over the grasses, kissed the dried riverbed, and finally reached the edge of the Mudbrick village. The sun always rose the same way, whether or not a warlord had passed through in the night. Inside the village, nothing looked broken. There were no charred beams, no toppled statues, no blood in the dust. But the signs were there if one knew how to see them. A reed mat had been kicked aside. A basket lid was missing. The rope used to tie a goat had been chewed through or cut, depending on how one looked at it. Some villagers tried not to notice at first. There was always the hope that nothing had happened, that it was all in their heads. But by mid-morning, the facts began to speak. One of the granary guards found the back wall disturbed. Just slightly. A shift in the mud. A hole refilled too cleanly. The goats were counted. 5 gone. No prints where they should be and too many where they shouldn't. Then came the whispering. Quiet at first and then louder. The word raiders wasn't said outright, not yet. But the air shifted with it. Mothers kept their children close. Men who had once guarded the village with staffs now looked at their hands and wondered why they'd felt so safe. Some suspected who had done it. These raids were not uncommon. Not in a time when city walls were few and farmland was hard-won. Everyone knew there were bands who lived off the wealth of others, who passed through the cracks in the law, never staying long enough to be caught. But knowing didn't help. Knowing never did. By noon, the elders met beneath the shade of the fig tree. They spoke in low voices, counting what had been lost. Not enough to cripple the village, but enough to hurt. Enough that someone would go hungry this winter. And that was always the beginning of worse things. Back on the ridge, many miles away, the warlord's men were dividing what they had taken. He let them. There was a system, not formal but understood. 2 shares for each man. 3 for the ones who took risk. A larger portion for the scout. And a generous cut for the warlord himself. He always took less than he could have. It bought him loyalty. Some of the grain would be ground by sunset. Some of it would be traded, carried north on the backs of donkeys, where towns along the river might exchange it for copper or honey or a length of dyed linen. The goats would be penned for now. Fat and calm, they'd be kept alive until needed. Fresh meat was a luxury you didn't waste without reason. The warlord watched all this with the calm detachment of a man who had seen it play out before. Many times, the faces changed, the names too, but the need was always the same. The field went dry, a river pulled back, a child needed feeding, and so a village somewhere else paid the cost. One of his men approached with news. Another village, smaller, just 3 days' walk to the west. Rumors of full grain stores, no strong walls, No recent contact with traders. That meant isolation, vulnerability, opportunity. The warlord said nothing, just nodded. But he made no move yet. There was always a gap between raids, letting dust settle, letting fear cool. His was not a campaign. There were no proclamations, no lines drawn in clay tablets. He took what was needed when it was needed. That was the ancient rhythm, one as old as the fields themselves. Later that evening, he sat beneath a tree with one of the younger boys from his band. A new recruit, barely grown, eager, eyes still bright with questions. The boy asked, "Why don't we just settle? Take a village and make it ours?" The warlord chewed his grain slowly before answering. "Because then we'd have to defend it," he said, "and others would come in the night." The boy didn't answer, but the lesson landed. In 2000 BCE, permanence was a risk. A building was a target. A wall was a dare. It was safer to move like the wind, unseen, unpredictable, and gone before it could be caught. The sun sank behind them, and the air cooled. The camp settled. Small fires burned low. Goats bleated quietly in their pen. And the warlord stared out at the stars, already thinking of the next village, the next map drawn in ash, the next set of footprints in the dust. He would wait, but not long. 3 days passed before the warlord moved again. Time was not wasted. His men repaired tools, repacked supplies, and patched sandals worn thin from years of dust and dry paths. The goats, though stolen, now grazed peacefully under the watchful eyes of boys with slings. No one in the camp spoke much. They didn't need to. They'd followed this warlord long enough to know that movement was always coming, just not announced in advance. Out in the scrubland, a lone scout returned, a man built for distance and silence. He carried news from the west. The village he spoke of was even smaller than the last, little more than a handful of homes gathered around a communal oven. But there was food. The scout had seen baskets being loaded with ground millet, a sign of a recent harvest. No fortified walls, no guards with metal weapons. Just farmers, families, and grain. The warlord listened carefully. He asked few questions but marked the direction on a piece of hardened leather, scoring the distance with a blade tip. He didn't need maps. He needed paths, distances between survival and hunger. That's what he measured. That night they set out, not in a rush but with practiced ease. The moon was bright enough to guide them. The path wound through fields gone dry, over shallow hills where stones outnumbered trees, and across a narrow ridge where river winds carved silent songs in the rocks. By the second night, they were within reach. This village was different, newer. You could tell by the straightness of the walls, the even spacing between homes. Someone here had planned it or tried to. The kind of place built by people who hoped to settle for good, who thought peace might last. The warlord didn't hate these people. He didn't even think of them as enemies. They were part of the system. He took from them because it was how balance was kept. If he didn't, someone else would. Maybe someone crueler. Someone who burned and pillaged instead of planning and leaving quietly. He watched from a low ridge, just as he had so many times before. He observed the timing of the cooking fires, noted when the village dogs stopped pacing, counted how many men stayed awake after sundown. There were only two. One walked a lazy circle near the pen of goats, carrying a torch more for comfort than protection. The other sat near the central oven, nodding off between gulps of warm beer. Their bodies told a story of routine, not readiness. The warlord waited, and then once again he moved. His men followed without question, down into the dark, between the stones, through the tall grass. They spread out like ink on papyrus, quiet, inevitable. There was no alarm this time, not even the dogs barked. He slipped through the narrow gate made of woven reeds and stepped into the space between two homes. The scent of clay, firewood, and crushed lentils filled the air. Somewhere inside, a baby cried once, then hushed. A lullaby was whispered in a dialect he didn't recognize, but he understood the meaning. Sleep, safety, a mother's promise. It was not his job to break those things, only to bend them. He moved to the storage hut. It was locked, a sign they had something worth hiding. He respected that. A thin wooden bar sealed the door. He lifted it slowly, easing the clay door aside with care. Inside, he found what he had hoped for. Stacks of millet, baskets of dried figs, even a roll of linen tucked beneath a stone slab. He took one basket, then another. Not all, never all. Outside, his men were already moving with practiced steps. One carried a woven net with 2 young goats. Another gathered clay pots, not for selling, but for boiling the food they now carried. It was a clean operation. No noise, no fear, until a man stepped out from a house and saw them. He wasn't a soldier, just a father. He blinked in confusion, holding a water jar, then dropped it when he understood. The warlord's man reached for his club. "Wait," the warlord said. The villager didn't run. He just stood there, frozen, stunned, powerless. The warlord took a step forward, slowly, measured. "You'll live," he said, voice low, "but feed fewer mouths next week." And then he turned and vanished into the dark, his men following behind, their arms full and footsteps light. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, they were already gone. The village they'd left behind was waking slowly. Doors creaked open. The oven was stoked. A boy rubbed his eyes and wandered outside, only to notice that the goat pen was too quiet. A jar of millet was gone. A side gate left ajar. The villager who had seen them spoke only to the elders. Quietly, he didn't tell the others. Not yet. What was there to gain? Fear traveled fast, and it never did anyone any favors. The loss would be counted, and life would go on. It had to. Far from there, the warlord's band was silent. The air was cooler now. Their path curved back toward the ridge country, where scrub trees and wind-blown rock formations hid the entrance to a small canyon. They'd made camp there before. It was secluded, dry, and easy to defend. As the others unloaded the grain and fed the goats, the warlord sat near the edge of a crumbling ledge and watched the land below, a patchwork of life. Smoke rose in delicate threads from villages that still slept in peace, at least for now. He wondered how many of those fires would become targets in time. He hadn't always lived this way. Once, in his younger years, he had been a farmer himself, a boy with cracked hands and sunburned shoulders. His family's land had been taken by another group during a dry year, not with weapons but by trade. They'd offered too little for too much, and his people had accepted, desperate. Later, when hunger came again, those tradesmen returned with spears. They called it payment. He remembered the night his father was pulled from their home. He remembered the silence afterward more than the screams. It was the moment he learned that strength was not about cruelty, but clarity. The world had rules, and only some of them were written. He had been writing his own rules ever since. Behind him, the young recruit, the same boy who had asked about settling, approached again. "Will we do it again?" the boy asked. The warlord nodded. When we need to." The boy seemed to accept that, but then he hesitated. "Do you think they hate us?" he asked. The warlord didn't answer right away. He let the wind speak for a moment, the dry rustle of grass, the faint bleating of goats, the sharp call of a bird overhead. "Maybe," he said at last, "but hate is just hunger dressed up with names." It was a lesson the boy would carry. Down in the canyon, the fire crackled. Grain was boiling in clay pots. The smell of it drifted through the air, warm, nutty, comforting. There would be food tonight. That meant strength. That meant safety. For now. Because in this land, in this time, no victory was permanent. No home entirely safe. Kingdoms would rise centuries later. Cities would carve laws into stone and seal their gates with bronze. But here, in the early stretch of human history, survival was still decided by those who moved, not those who stayed still. The warlord stood. He looked at his people, not an army, not a tribe, but something in between. Survivors, raiders, ghosts of the margins. They would rest, then move again, as they always had, and long after he was gone, and his name was forgotten, long after temples were built and scrolls written and kings buried in gold. there would still be someone watching the horizon. Still someone drawing a plan in the dirt with the end of a spear. Still someone asking, "How do you invade a mudbrick village?" And someone answering, "You wait until they forget that you exist. Then you walk in quietly and take what the earth gave to them." Because in 2000 BCE, history wasn't yet made of heroes. It was made of those who knew when to vanish.